Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. we're popping off today. But no podcast. I'm Blake. We got Kyle. No Doug today.
No Doug.
But we're pastors of Living Springs Church and here to take you on a adventure through Scripture and all the twists and turns of faith. So we're excited to do that. If you've got questions, we've got answers. Well, maybe.
Try it.
Well, we got probably more questions is what ends up happening when you guys listen to us. But join us as we celebrate, explore, and just check out the beautiful complexities of this belief.
Yeah.
So, Kyle, you ready to dive in?
I think we're going to. We're probably not. We're probably setting up our first question a little bit deeper than our first one actually is. At least it's subject matter. But we do all those deep and important things. But yes, our first one, looking at our docket today, is less intense to begin with.
Yes,
but
a little more timely. We have an interfaith soccer tournament that we've been invited to as a church by another church that's running it in our community.
Yep.
So the question says, I know the idea of an interfaith soccer tournament was in good faith, but is it truly interfaith if we can only include other Christians? Or is this exclusionary in nature?
Yeah. I will. I'll say I'm thankful for this questioner's noticing of language, because that was one of the first things I noticed when we got the invitation for it. Now, fortunately, unbeknownst to probably the questioner, I've gotten to know a little bit the guy who's putting this whole thing forward. And so in his defense, I will say I don't think he ever meant it couldn't be interfaith in the fullest sense of the term, but it is for Airdrie. And so Airdrie, as far as I know, Blake, you can correct me if I'm wrong, though we have an Islamic center, we don't have at all why am I blanking on the word right now?
Like a mosque.
Yeah. We don't have a mosque. We don't have a formal Islamic center or mosque and Islamic community that way. Though I'm sure if somebody wanted to put a team forward, they'd have to ask Rick. He's running it. But getting to know him a little bit, his heart just for connecting Airdrie, that I don't think it was meant to be exclusionary. Though, as it stands, we don't have any other religions formally established in the same way as we do churches. So, maybe interfaith was a misnomer. Interdenominational soccer tournament might have been more accurate to what is going forward, unless somebody else steps up and says, hey, we want to put forward our Islamic group. Then that would be up to the organizers of it. But I did notice the funny language surrounding the tournament.
All right. So I'll ask because I might not be alone, or maybe I am. But interfaith then would mean greater than Christian churches. Is that what the...
Yeah, interfaith. So interdenominational would represent more what has been advertised through this.
Yeah.
To say, hey, all the churches of Airdrie are going to get together. I believe the description begins with, we want to make this initiative in Christian camaraderie or Christian something like that.
Yeah.
So immediately then, yes, technically excluding by that language, if you lean on that interpretation of the promo, that it is then more just for Christian denominations, which a better use of word would be interdenominational soccer tournament. Interfaith is bringing multiple faiths together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say, as someone who's grown up in Airdrie, and I think Rick is the fellow's name who is putting this together. Yeah. I know he's been in Airdrie a long time too. Interfaith, it could mean just all the churches in Airdrie, because that's, like you said, there's no other.
Now, some people
out there, right?
would draw some hairs. I know you'd probably have grown up with this familiar language of those Catholics. They're not Christian.
Well, yes, that's
so
there is
maybe in some interpretations
in there. Right?
This is interfaith. That's not where we stand. In case you're listening for the first time, but I guess that could be one application of it. But no, I think just it was a simple misuse of language. Though I can't say one way or another. But I would, knowing Rick, assume if somebody came forward that was of another faith that wanted to put it forward a tournament, I don't see why they wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
But we wanted to answer that one just in a timely manner. So we made the decision, as we sometimes do, sometimes to Doug's argumentation, that we bump certain questions ahead of the list. But he's not here right now, so we can do what we want. Pew, pew, pew.
Meaning you can do your finger guns.
Yeah, exactly. Did that one just for Doug in case he catches up to
you
this
guys
episode.
should check the video on that one.
Yep.
Right on. Okay, well, next question then. what are your thoughts on short-term mission trips? Do they have any value? And how can we effectively fulfill the Great Commission?
Those are 3 giant questions.
I looked at this question yesterday, and I thought those, to me, aren't necessarily connected.
No, depending on how we strike them.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
you want to jump in, Blake?
I'll start with my thoughts on short-term mission trip.
Sure.
And I'll just say awesome. Yep. All the trips that I've experienced have been really good. I think there is value in them. I guess that's the second question.
Yep.
But I do understand bigger picture. I guess for me, bigger picture is we can fundraise. I think the last mission trip that I organized, I was a youth pastor for years. So I think we fundraised like around $15,000 to $20,000 for the trip.
Yep.
So that covered all our expenses for like 15 of us to travel down to Mexico City. Yep. And then extra money was put into the project that we did. And I think giving away, anything extra beyond that. Yep. So that's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I do remember, and I've had people ask me, is that the best use of the money?
Yep.
Like as far as what we did, we helped an orphanage build, right? Yep. We could have sent 20 grand and they would have done way more with that 20,000 than we accomplished with our unskilled labor of 15 youth kids there, right?
Yep.
So as far as when you talk about value, then you got to determine what that means. Because if you're just talking about dollars and cents, then yes, we can probably send money to another country or another place that would go further. When you talk about value for bang for the buck, like for our kids that went down there, I think they got to see another part of the world that they hadn't seen. They got to see poverty that probably hadn't grown up in. They got to experience Christianity in a pretty intense environment. Like we did devos and we did, things that practically connected the word of God to the mission of God. If we're talking about, helping the needy and the poor, and then value for the people there. Well, we built relationships. And I know some of our teens who are now adults still have relationships with some of those people down there. I know that that's there. So, you're not going to get that if we just sent them 20 grand. You would miss all that. So I guess that's my starting point as far as thinking about do missions have value. I just say I'm on the yes side. I think mission trips do have value. Financially, you could debate that with me. I'd be okay with that. But
there's a book I was just looking up, 2014, When Helping Hurts. How to alleviate poverty without hurting poor and yourself. Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert. Found that one interesting. They do a lot of talk on the short-term missions specifically there. And so I've heard all the arguments against short-term missions. And I agree with the damage that's being done by them in some terms.
What would some of those arguments be?
One, a lot of them do center around the better use of finances. That we would be much more effective per dollar by allowing local people to do it. You've got cultural, just kind of bringing in white dominance, typically in all these things. You've got, so there's a lot of layers that in regard to that. So I don't disregard those arguments, and I since have long stopped arguing for short-term missions as though we're going down to make this great difference because of all those. And instead realize the greatest value is actually for those going. So yes,
I like that.
We could much better use your example, $20,000 by sending it down directly to Mexico City for local laborers to do all that. And absolutely, I think we need to be careful and thinking of that and have a balance of doing that more often, of assuming we as the well-equipped white people can go down to whatever it is or go away to wherever it is. And solve the problem. But I will say this, where the great value is in the people that go, I think is far beyond them just sending let's say the $1,000 for $1,200 per person. How much more are those lives impacted where for a lifelong commitment now, they will be involved in some other expression of the kingdom of God being made tangible elsewhere. So let's say you take 15 people, and each of them is a $1,200 cost to get down there. I would argue the impact that has on their lifetime will far exceed $1,200 sent down one time in their commitment to making a difference, because they've seen poverty, because they've seen the work of God, because they've understood culture. Maybe they go on subsequent trips. Maybe they send more money to another missionary. They keep the relationships going. They help drive initiatives in their local church that the pastor that's too busy won't otherwise prioritize making some missions involvement. Now you've got people who have seen it and go, I want to argue for that. So the difference, in my view, all the values and the impact it makes on us who could easily just be disconnected from local missions. Yes, our dollars would be better served to do that, to just send it down. But I think the long-term perspective that I have gained and I've seen others gain about the kingdom in their lives and everywhere else globally is worth it in balance.
Yeah. Another thought that I've had over the years, and lots of churches have, I shouldn't say lots. Some churches have like a mission organization or a mission club, whatever you want to call it, that take care of the missions.
Yep.
Some churches have, senior leadership that care about missions, so they do it, right? Like I always use this term that a church is victim to whoever their pastors are.
Totally.
Because whatever their pastor thinks is important, that's probably what the church is going to do, right? But typically, missions trips land on youth pastors' plates. Right. It just seems to be that's what happens, right?
Yep.
So when I was in the youth pastoring world, yes, I was aware of all these discussions, and I asked those questions because I wanted our listeners to know, what are the discussions, right?
Yep.
One of the ones that I thought for myself was this shotgun approach that, we go to Mexico City because that would be cool. Where are we going next year? Well, I'd love to go to Bali. So let's go to, and we go to all the places that are like the places I would like to visit, which I don't think is wrong in the sense of you're still going and doing missions and there's value to it. But I did respect a little more and like the churches that I thought were doing a little more intentional, where they'd go to a place and then build a relationship and go there again and again.
Totally.
And I know Living Springs was doing that with Guatemala for a little bit. I just feel like probably if you're talking about value again, now there's an opportunity for those relationships to grow. And I'm not sure what you did with Guatemala because I won't speak to that, but I know the one church that I did know of well, they were actually sending missions teams back and forth. So they would bring missions from, I can't remember where they were involved with, but they'd bring youth their way and run soccer camps in Edmonton.
Amazing.
And then they'd send their teens down to do work projects down wherever they were, right?
That's beautiful.
So I was like, when you start talking about value, then the exponential value started to go. And the last little bit that I was youth pastor, that was what I was trying to do with Mexico City, is I was like, I think we should build this relationship where we just continue to go to the same place and have value there. So that's one way I think you can add value to it. I don't know if it's the only way. And I won't say like going to different places is not horrible in any way. It just, it's harder, I guess, to build those relationships if you're going to a different place each time you go on a mission trip, right?
Oh, totally. But there's a pro and a cons list to every approach. So if we just all of a sudden pulled the plugs, like that's it, no more short-term mission trips. The amount of people that I do think our congregations here in the global north would suffer for that, of not being able to see and understand. We would be entirely then, in a lot of ways, disconnected from our brothers and sisters in the faith who are suffering. We'd be disconnected from poverty in ways that we don't see it here in North America or the global north, period. That there would be a big loss. And so to see that is important. And it also just removes us from the, for lack of a better term, privilege of being able to just throw money at a problem. Like we need to be involved relationally. So there's a pro and a cons list to both. And so to keep the relationships healthy, to have the impact, to be aware, those are valuable things that I think would be lost if we stop doing them. But again, it's got to be all in balance. So maybe for every one mission trip we take a group of people on at a high cost, we're able to do another project or two that are just being able to send that to the local organizations who are there. We're in this interesting dynamic now where the global south of Christianity is where the majority of interest and population of Christianity is.
Right.
But they lack the resources and the historical training centers, universities, Bible colleges, all that are well equipped to trained pastors are mostly in the global north where Christianity is declining.
Yeah.
So we've got the money and we've got the resources, but we don't have the people.
Yeah.
And the south has the people and they don't have the resources. So we're in this really interesting spot where we globally have to work together. Like, okay, we're in this post-Christian society in Canada. It doesn't mean we just give up, but like we still do effort in evangelizing and sharing the message here, but realizing there is a massive boom in the global south, but they're lacking the ability to train their pastors and build their churches and all those kind of things. And we do have a position of privilege with wealth available to us. And so there's unique dependence that's built into the church in this day that is needed for those relationships to sustain. And I think the only way to have real relationships is to be connected involving visits.
Yeah.
So I just think there's a really unique need for that connection, even though we can always just argue effectiveness. I don't think the church has always been built on effectiveness as much as it's built on faithfulness. And faithfulness to relationships sometimes comes at a big cost. That's not always the most responsible decision, but neither's me and my wife going out on a date.
Yeah, totally.
It's building into the relationship that's there, but it's done with wisdom and articulated well, and we're going to not ever strike that balance perfectly, but it's something where we need those relationships to be built on.
Yeah. And maybe as I say this, it will transition to the second part of this question a little bit, but it's interesting. Like there's need everywhere. And I mean, the more I got into mission stuff and had a heart for it, because I do have a heart for that, it became really clear to me, like, okay, so we go to Mexico City and we do this, but we have people in poverty, like on the streets of Calgary.
Totally.
Right. So why couldn't we help them? Like, how come we have to travel or put
Totally.
20 grand into a trip when we could put $1,000 into a trip and help people right here?
Yeah.
I think of our Indigenous communities. We've talked about that on our podcast before. Like if you want to see poverty and see people living in it, there's lots of communities right here in Alberta that look just as poor and bad off as, you know, Mexico City or any place you can name.
Yeah.
Quebec, the whole province of Quebec is one of the most least reached people groups in our world. So that's in our own country.
Totally.
So yeah, there was a season of me going, hang on, where is the best place to invest, right?
Yep.
And I say personally to people all the time, the best place to invest is where you have passion.
Yep.
Right? If you're passionate about Quebec, then get over there. If you have passion about Mexico City, get to there, right?
Yep.
If downtown Calgary is your place, then serve there, right? But I don't think we have to go overseas or into another country to provide missional care. Or to evangelize or do any of the things you think we should be called to as a Christ follower, I guess.
Yeah. I was just going to look up a book quick. I'll cite it offhand and maybe somebody will be able to actually find it. I listened to a podcast years ago that stuck with me. It was like The Worst Missionary's Wife or something like that. Where she highlighted there are a lot of holes in the way we do missions, even the long-term investments of somebody who's there on the ground and then the teams that come join them, which I think is the better way of doing it than just the shotgun approach like you talked about. But it was interesting. So I'm not saying there aren't ways we can, again, tighten up and get better at being aware of what's being spent and how it's being done. But I think there is value to answer that part of the question. Is there value? Absolutely. Can we fine-tune it? For sure.
Well, and I think, I don't know where the beginning of missions would be. Like, I don't know, when a church sent the first, missionary outside of like Paul being commissioned, but I'm talking about like our current, maybe North American type idea of church. I know the Christian and Missionary Alliance history fairly well because I had to take a class when I became a pastor for them. And I got interested in it, so I read lots of books on them. There's a time, late 1800s, where they're doing like tent meetings. So you're just inviting everybody, if it was in Airdrie, to come to this tent meeting, on a Saturday night. They worship, they like get all excited, they preach, and then they do a call and say, who wants to go to Africa? Like this is serious. And they wouldn't even name like the location in Africa. It's just Africa. And you put up your hand, and then they'd ask for money to send these people. And traditionally in Canada, especially in the Christian Missionary Alliance, but I think it's probably in all denominations, it was typically single women. Not a lot of men put up their hands. And these women would come on stage and they'd commission them right there, like lay hands on them and pray for them. And within a month or two, they would put them on a boat and sail them to Africa. Like, I mean, that's probably the worst mission plan ever.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But I would never disagree with or naysay the heart of it.
Totally.
Like, the heart was the gospel of Jesus needs to be preached. And this is, you know, we are called to go forth and to, like, you know, make our world, you know, disciple our world.
Yeah.
And when those people heard that call, they stood up and said, I want to go.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to give them trouble for their intentions.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So there's a lot of value in it. But then how do we effectively fulfill the Great Commission, Blake?
Yeah, that's a different question, I guess, in the sense, because I don't know that, I guess, and that's where I was getting at a little bit. I don't know that you have to go to Africa to fulfill the Great Commission, right? The Great Commission is baptize and...
per capita, I'd say Africa as a whole is probably more Christian than North America.
Totally. Okay, well, pick your country. It doesn't matter, right? But you have neighbors right next door to you. You have family and friends and people you work with who don't know the Lord.
Yeah.
So if you feel like, you know, fulfilling the Great Commission means to evangelize or to share the gospel, what you believe about Jesus with other people, you can do that anywhere. And honestly, I would say that's what you're supposed to do. Right. It's like, again, probably with your passion a little bit, but also just with your, like, if you feel called by God to live a Christian faith, then the people around you should know you live a Christian faith. Yeah. So I guess that's where I'll start with that. I don't know, you can jump in.
Well, I'll cite a book that I know we both love is The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
I was sure you were going to go there.
I don't know if we haven't already, to the majority of the degree, already accomplished this. Like, she said, Jerusalem, Judea, the ends of the earth. Like, check. Mm-hmm. For the most part, other than a few entirely unreached people groups, I want to be careful. I don't want to say I don't think it's important to keep finding new groups if there are some that haven't been reached. And
Absolutely.
I'm thinking specifically of my conversation with a guy who I know listens to this podcast, working with Wycliffe, reaching groups in the middle of Peru, bringing them the Bible. That is incredible, good work and needs to continue to happen. But most of us are not able to be involved in such efforts. Most of us are not waiting for an opportunity to go find one more untouched people group, as you've already alluded to. And most of us, I don't think, need to take on the idea of just yelling a simplified version of the gospel at a bunch of people and hoping they take it. Like, I think the idea of the Great Commission is to go, yes, and tell people about it and baptize them in the name. But Jesus' other part of the Great Commission is teach them all the things that I have commanded you. And we as Christians are not always doing a great job at living, let alone teaching all of what Jesus commanded. And not just stop your sins, but what does it look like to live a full life? Life to the full as Jesus offers it to us. And so the patient ferment of the early church, and why that comes up to me, is at one point he cites how there was widows actually corrected for sharing the gospel loosely. Right. Because it's a lifelong commitment to somebody. If I were to come share the message of the gospel to you, Blake, I now, as a Christian obligation in their perspective, now need to dedicate the remainder of my life to discipling you.
Yes.
Not just throwing the gospel out for a hand up.
Yeah, and that's so, like, that's the beauty of that book and understanding that part of history is it's so different than the way we think. Like, even I don't know who asked this question and what you're thinking, but I would say for the general population of churchgoers, they have heard, or, you know, someone has told them the Great Commission, go therefore and make all disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them, you know, and continuing on. And then the weight of that is that I have to tell people about Jesus. And I don't know how to do that. So we've simplified it to a track, right? Which is very nice. You know, we can hand it out, or we teach people how to say it well. And then you're obligated to tell people. I know a guy in our church that's scared to death that he hasn't done it enough, that he's going to die and he hasn't done this and Jesus is going to judge him for it, which is crazy. But again, what you're saying is that really doing it, right? Just because I tell somebody this is what I believe, you know, you better believe it too, or you might burn, right? That's usually how we, you know, land it. And then there's no obligation to help that person do exactly what the Great Commission actually says.
Just shotgun, like
disciple them, teach them, live with them. Which is what you're saying in the Patient Ferment was that was the obligation. If you share the gospel, you are now obligated to befriend this person and live with them. Right?
Totally. And so it's this entirely different approach. And he cites over and over, like, for the time period, Christianity has never grown faster than when they intentionally weren't evangelizing. Right? When they were instead working on how do I make sure there's as much Christian character in me? Am I living the way of Jesus as possible? His habitus is what he talks about, right? But how do I form that in me? And from there is the work of the Spirit that continues to draw people into a movement who is completely passionate about that. And so the Great Commission, in a lot of ways, is largely fulfilled. And we can keep reaching for the few more, but for the average person following Jesus now, I think it looked much more like a radical commitment to living the way of Jesus, and then where he has placed you, continuing to share that to the people around you. I heard somebody too a long time ago, and it's also stuck with me. They were saying how when Jesus gave the Great Commission, most people were not very transient. They lived within a certain number of miles of where they were born, and they died there too. In our world, it is very common to move multiple times to multiple cities in your lifetime. You're an anomaly, Blake. Like when people like get to Airdrie, most of them are not from here. And then I love getting to point out, you should meet my friend Blake. He's been here for his whole life. And they look at me like I've got 3 heads.
Yeah, you're like, that's not normal.
What? And so this one lady was saying the Great Commission, as the way she understands it today, is not go therefore, but stay therefore. And preach the good news. Like build relationships and invest in communities and make a difference. And that was how she saw the same level of commitment that Jesus was radically calling people to then, of like, go somewhere else. That's hard. She was saying the hard thing today is actually stay, regardless of financial incentive to go elsewhere for a job. You stay and invest in a community as they continue to be transient around you. It was like this really unique perspective that I go, for the average Christian to fulfill the Great Commission, live deeply into the life that Jesus has called you and watch the opportunities that he's going to hand you versus preaching on street corners or anything like that. If it comes to missions, couple quick bullet points, like we've mentioned lots of times, Bruchko, fantastic book. We need to be very careful of how we export whiteness or North American culture instead of actually just what it means to bring the gospel universally into a culture and allow it to land in its location there. We could talk more about that. I won't continue to drag us too deep into that conversation. And in long-term relationship, and I believe the message of the gospel needs to be brought alongside with the tangible evidence of it. And so I think that is best done when we are bringing in the healing, the relational difference, the justice, the mercy, the grace in all the tangible ways, so that then it can be seen and known. Where is the source of all this stuff coming from? It's from the kingdom of Jesus. And so the provision for it is then brought from that. And so if we're going to effectively do that, it's not just turn or burn messages dropped and then run away from, but instead tangible impact made in the world to show as the proof and evidence of the kingdom of God is breaking in.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had this conversation more, personally one-on-one, like, talking to somebody about this, and when they ask, like, how do I share my faith? How do I fulfill the Great Commission? I like to ask them, how did you become a believer? And then when they share that story, I just say, do that. And most of the time, it is because, either a parent, family member, friend has told them about Jesus and then lived that with them, right? And so I say, do that, right? If you're a parent, if your parents told you about Jesus, then introduce your kids to Jesus, right? If, your coworker did, then do that, right? Because I haven't met, and I can ask you this, and I'd ask any of our viewers, send in an opinion if you have an answer to this, but I just haven't met many people that got saved because a guy on a street corner was yelling through a megaphone, or even at a crusade, just because of the crusade. I'd say someone brought them to a crusade, then got them into a church and walked with them as friends through that. but just heard the message and decided, I'm a Christian and walked it out by themselves because of the crusade. I don't think that has happened very often. I think lots of people put up their hand and get saved at a crusade, and I guess you can explain what that is in a second. But I don't know that many of them make that long-term commitment to follow Jesus.
For those that don't know, a crusade was a poorly named Christian movement of these one-time really events, often to drop in, offer the message of the gospel, surrounded with music and fun and all that kind of stuff. And we could have a whole other conversation around those. Crusades specifically under the tutelage of Billy Graham and the following organizations. Other people did similar things, often under the name revivals.
There's still lots of them.
So yes, I agree. There's probably few yelled into the kingdom of God, few probably in a vacuum that just came to a crusade without any relationship surrounding it that stayed with that. I would love to know the stats on what does it look like for somebody a year after those. Those I have a hard time wondering about their effect.
I don't know that you can do the vacuum thing very well. And I don't know crusades like, before 20 years ago, but the Billy Graham Association, and now his son Franklin has continued that on. I was part of one they did called Rock the River in Calgary quite a few years ago. And they do, so I won't naysay them. I want to promote them here. Do follow up like huge. Like if someone came to the front and committed themselves to the Lord, then they got their information and like were on them that next week, like with emails, phone calls, trying to connect them with a person. Back to the relational part, right? So they could, tie them in and help them live out this faith. So it wasn't just leave them alone and see what happens.
No.
But I do wonder what happens if you do leave them alone and see what happens, right? So the stats would be skewed that way, right? But I find it interesting that for some reason there is this Christian weight or belief that that's how we need to tell people about Jesus, even though that's probably not my personal experience of how I became a Christian. So that's why I like to ask that question and then challenge people that way, like, do what brought you to Christ. Because it worked. Right?
Well, I think there's been a long history of saying, well, Jesus will come back once we reach all the nations. Right? So
it's true. So if we just blast it out there.
We got to hasten the day of the Lord's coming by bringing out this message and making sure every nation and tribe and tongue hears it so that one day, when we get there, check, we've got them all, Jesus can come back.
Which could happen. We won't know until that day comes.
Totally. So that is a bit of long. I would argue with that view of theology, but we'll save that for another day. Now, Peter does talk about live in such a way that hastens the day of the coming of the Lord. So there is, anyways, we won't go there. So there's been that pressure, but I also think it's been a mounted out of, as many things, out of a good starting place. A real passion for that. I don't think you can pass along somebody's passion. And so we've all known people who are just deeply passionate about passing along the gospel of Jesus. And then all of a sudden, when somebody tries to replicate that without the depth of somebody else, it becomes this obligation. And that carries a lot of weight and guilt for others. And so there's been a lot of that applied, I think, throughout the church, which is too bad. I will say in effectively fulfilling the Great Commission too, like things that we can fine tune and look at. I think regularly questioning and examining the way we articulate our faith to our culture and to our context. And I don't just mean that in words. And we've had talked about what that looks like. What is the gospel? How do we articulate that in just a verbal recitation in some way? And that's important. How we talk about the gospel is important. But I think more than just down to a soteriology of what it means to be saved or anything like that, talking about penal substitutionary atonement and how that all fits in. More than that, how does it look like for the landing of the gospel in a life of somebody living in suburban Alberta, Airdrie here, for our context, what does it look like to have the kingdom land in my life? How does that make a difference? And I think it's the responsibility of every Christian to look at the places where God has placed them and see how the kingdom of God would make a difference. So you can then articulate that to people of, this is what it would mean in my neighbor's marriage. This is what it would mean in my cousin's financial situation. This is what it would mean. And we begin to be able to speak about that. And so to bring and to fulfill the Great Commission in that part of telling them about Jesus, as well as then teaching all he's commanded, so that you can draw them in and give an apologetic, a defense of the faith. This is what it means to follow this. Then you can draw people into this kingdom instead of just weigh a guilt of, you have to follow Jesus or else you're going to spend eternity in heaven. And again, we could talk and debate that, heaven or hell. But instead, how do we fulfill that Great Commission? You draw people to something by being able to articulate what it means in their context.
Yeah, and I do take this pretty seriously. Like, as we're talking, I'm like, it's easy, I think, from a Christian perspective or people who've lived the faith a long time to kind of, get a bad taste in their mouth about evangelism because there has been a weight and obligation put on it. And, you do see people from time to time doing maybe what you think is a poor job of it, maybe street corner stuff. I was in Seattle. I've been to Seattle 3 times in the last year and a half, and I've been to baseball games all those times. And every time there's a guy standing with a megaphone right outside, Seattle. He's not allowed to stand on the corner. Like, the stadium takes up a whole city block. He can't stand on that side of the street, so he stands across the street and just like blasts people with this megaphone, and he's just reading scripture, and he's just like. And I've watched it all 3 times because you're standing in line to get in. And I'm like, has that ever worked? Like, is there anybody? And I'd like to know. And if it's worked once, well, then I guess it's worth it. But I just wonder, has anybody ever crossed the street, plugged their ears to get close to his megaphone and said, hey, I'd like to know more about what you're talking about, right? But back to the side of it where I think it is something we're supposed to do, it is biblical. And if I do care about Jesus, I should be sharing my faith. But when I look at, my context, you already outed me for only living in Airdrie, so I can only speak about Airdrie, Alberta. I think of the churches here. We have a couple of big churches in town. Big because I think they attract people with their entertainment value and, the programs they have as a church. So it's easy to go there. But when it ends up happening is it's more and more Christians who already know Jesus go to these churches. Even ours. I'd say we're one of the bigger churches in Airdrie. Most people that come in our door are people who already know Jesus. They've moved here from another city. They, and they geographically might be close to our church or denominationally or whatever else, or they're invited by a friend, but they walk in the door and they already know Jesus. Or we get people who've lived in Airdrie for a while, get discontented with the church you're in, and then check us out as the next choice. Very rarely do we get new people here, new believers, or someone wanting to know Jesus. Now, it does happen, and I'm proud of our church for that, but I think we got a city of 82,000 people. Is that what
85.
85 is what?
Projected to be over 100 by 2030, I think.
And, we have churches here, but how much are we sharing Jesus? And, what is the realistic expectation? If you have, a couple of thousand Christians in this city, if we were all, sharing Jesus, relationally and effectively, over a period of time, you'd think we should get a couple more thousand Christian people in this city, right? Like, it just feels like that should be the way it grows. And yet I've lived here 48 years and I haven't seen that exponential growth. So I don't know if we're doing the Great Commission well. When you ask me this question, how do we effectively do it? I'd say differently than we are in Airdrie at the moment, because it doesn't seem to be working as well as I think it should. Maybe my expectations are wrong. I don't know. But,
No, I agree with you.
So maybe you need to ask somebody different than me, because maybe I don't have the best answer. But right on. Well, if you got more questions or you want follow up on that stuff, definitely send some more in. Send some A&R. Or AER, and R. Just
and R.
Next question: are Noah's 3 sons triplets?
This is something I had not heard of anybody talking about beforehand.
Yeah.
And just this morning, before the podcast, did pull up where such a thought would come from.
Okay.
So I would have said no, and I still, just to show my hand early, will say no, but I see where it comes from. So Genesis 5:32 says, after Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So a direct reading of that verse in the midst of all the other things that are there, just that verse alone, you would go, oh, at 500, Noah became a father of those three. Now, typically how that would work, especially in these quick offhand, just like mentioning a genealogy, is it's often, as it was in those days, referring to your firstborn.
Yeah.
So Noah first became a father at 500 years old to Shem, and then also to make sure to mention the other boys in the family, mentions Ham and Japheth,
right.
Not necessarily showing that they were triplets. So to say why I land here, Genesis 10:21 says, sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. So it goes on later to show that. And then Genesis 9:24, when Noah awoke from his wine and found what his youngest son Ham had done to him. So these quick offhand statements show some age distinction, though just that one verse alone would highlight, could lead you to think they were triplets.
Although I was at a funeral a while ago for some kids who were in my youth group. Their dad had passed away, and they're twins.
Okay.
And they got up to do tribute to their dad, and the one said, I'm the older brother, and then kind of laughed, right? So
yeah,
I guess that doesn't disqualify them from being triplets.
True, okay. So there's more to be debated then. Yeah, that is funny.
But I would say, other than those scriptures, we have no way of knowing that.
Yeah.
I think it would be easier to assume they were not.
Yep.
Just because triplets are rare. So
yep. And we have one set of twins that I can think of in the Bible, Jacob and Esau.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have another set that I can think of, but it makes a big deal out of their twinship.
Right.
I think that'd be the appropriate word, twinship. Yeah. We'll go with it. That I would say if there were triplets, there would be some importance there, and there'd be some more narrative around it. Would be my guess.
Yeah.
So I would also assume by the lack of distinction that they probably weren't. Yeah.
All right. We'll leave that one and move on.
All right.
This question says, what steps of action should be taken if a pastor on staff is found to be bullying or belittling congregation and members of the staff or volunteer team? I really hope this question is not about me.
Yeah, yeah. Everybody that knows you, Blake, knows that you are a key instigator of bullying. I say that if you don't know our church context very well, that would be the last person on staff to be assumed to be bullying.
It's the ones you don't assume, though, right? Like, or you at least assume they're the bad guys.
Fair. I'll echo. And it's much more likely that it might be me. So I'll hope it's not me. But all jokes aside, I'll say I really do hope this is not something that is found in our church. And
well, I hope this is a fictional question by anyone who is listening. And I will make the assumption and hope that it's about just general context in Bible land or Christian land that we live in. There is stories of this, right? So I hope this is not happening to someone because this is not good.
No. So this is there's going to be lots of different answers depending on the scenario here. What I will begin with is what won't help is allowing the frustrations and hurt somebody's found to develop in a way that won't end up actually making a difference, but instead make things worse in the sense of talking about it just amongst others with no intention of making a difference. Yep. That never does well in any community.
Right.
So I would not encourage you necessarily to just begin speaking to a group of other people within the church context without finding a way to intentionally see that there would be a difference made. Mm-hmm. I've seen that happen in churches.
Yep.
Not to say that, anyways, we'll leave that there. So then the ways to go about it are going to be, we've been encouraged to be as cunning as serpents and as innocent as doves. So there is a level of tact that you need to discern on how to do these things. I would hope, and I try to live in a very open way myself where I welcome and seek out critique. step one, it'd be wonderful if the easiest step is to go, I've seen something happen in this church's life or this pastor's life. I'm going to go speak to them directly.
Yep.
That would be my best case scenario. Now, I understand if that's the nature of it, that may not always be the case. So then you're going to look for whatever are other ways that are viable and the authority structure based on the church.
Yeah.
So you can go to maybe some other leaders. If I were the bully, let's put it in our context, go speak to one of the other pastors. I encourage you most likely to be able to speak to Doug in our context, or to one of the other pastors who you have an established relationship with. And I don't know Doug very well, so I'll go to Blake and talk to him how to navigate this with Blake.
Yeah.
That'd be a good one. But beyond that, I also see you could also assume those pastors look like they're really close to one another.
Yep.
So it'd be hard to talk to Blake or Doug about Kyle. So I'm not sure how to do that. So then that's where your church governance structure would be an important one.
Yep.
I would encourage finding out who the board members are and being able to speak to them, as most boards are then the authority over even the pastors as representations of the church.
Yeah.
That again, I've been in some real small church contexts, so that could also seem like this real tight-knit, closed-off group too.
Yeah.
So a level of anonymity would be helpful to be able to drop a letter of some format. Most church websites have some kind of anonymous ability to be able to send a message. I know ours does. There's a form you can fill out. You don't have to include your name and email, I don't think. But that's hard to substantiate. So I would more go towards a letter to the church board in some kind of way there, asking for discretion regarding that so they can deal with it. And then I think, as always, especially you go to Jesus' words in Matthew 18, disputes amongst people should always be solved in a relationship. Yeah. So I think the ability to just drop that anonymously and not make any difference, to be able to substantiate for your healing, that would be difficult to do it completely removed. So I'd encourage a relational dynamic. So larger churches I know have some good HR processes, that then there's formal systems but I know that's not most churches.
Yeah.
So going to either other pastors or the board are typically your best routes of approach.
Yeah, this one's hard. When I read this question, it made me sad because obviously this does happen. I mean, it can happen anywhere. Just because someone's a pastor doesn't mean that they're above this, or even just taking authority in a way that shouldn't be taken, right?
Yeah.
But because most churches don't have an HR program and stuff like that, it is different than maybe a business context.
Yep.
And it is highly relational. And if you're in a smaller church, your pastor might be unwilling to listen to you.
Yep.
If you go to them. With Matthew 18, it says take someone else. So it's probably a good idea if you've been in a conversation with someone and they haven't, listened to you the way you feel like you've been heard or seen, then take a friend with you and go back and try again. That is the biblical way to do it. But you could be fighting an uphill battle as far as, if the pastor, and maybe if they have other pastors on staff or buddies or even the board, if they protect the pastor, and there could be lots of reasons for that and good reasons, right? Hopefully they're not covering anything up, but if they have good relationship with him, they're going to stick up for, their church leader. Sometimes that's hard to prove that this leader or this pastor is misbehaving. Yep. Now, if the pastor is misbehaving enough, it won't be hard to prove for long.
Yeah.
Because probably if they're doing this to one person, they're doing it to more than that person. And usually the proof is kind of in the pudding and, you're going to find out, right?
Yeah.
But it definitely needs to be done carefully. But I would say, as you've said, Kyle, the gossip train is not the way to deal with this, right? It's to go directly and to try to say, these are my concerns. In my lifetime, I've realized it's hard to call out someone's integrity or character.
Yep.
Right? Like you can, there's proof of if you've yelled curse words at me, that I can say you did.
Yep.
But if it's the innuendo or it's the, just I feel uncomfortable around
comment
you,
or the eye roll.
Then it's hard to nail that down. And it's hard to tell somebody, tell on somebody for that kind of thing, right? Yeah. Yet it doesn't make it untrue. Like I definitely, I'm on the side of the innocent and the injustice that's being done. I want justice to be done. I'm just saying it's a hard thing.
Yeah. And I will lament, we've seen a lot of stories of that the last number of years.
Yep.
We've got the Church Too movement coming right out of the Me Too movement, seeing that there have been lots of places where church power has been misused.
Yep.
We see stories like Mars Hill and everything that has happened there. There were people, it took them years to be able to speak up about the things that they'd faced, and individually they were blanketed. So don't at all hear that we're not saying that it's not hard, and I know you're not implying that at all, Blake. And so I'm sorry for any personal cost if this is something you faced, if this is coming from a personal experience. But also, I would encourage you, like, don't be silent either. Like, don't suffer in it. Yeah. Let's find those ways. If you want to reach out to us and see how if we're not the bullies ourselves, to be able to speak to it, to be able to see that difference. I think God's heart is for compassion and for justice, to be able to have these wrongs made right. And I think the church should be a safe place to do that. And so I think there should be ways to find ability to make these things right and to bring these to light so that corrections can be made. Knowing enough pastors, know most of them, it's the approach that you need to make to be able to get there. And I think a lot of people in hindsight, as any human, will get defensive really quickly and or get our guard up when any accusations are brought forward to us. But overall, I'd say the heart of most pastors that I've gotten to know was when they've made those mistakes, as we come around, as we approach it well, they want to find change like most humans, but it's how to do that and do that well so it doesn't bring the person down as well. Is an important one.
Yep. Keelan, how much time do we got? 8 minutes? Okay. We can probably finish on this question just because I got a couple more things to say. This one makes me sad too, with the Church Too movement, all that stuff, because those things are real. Like, I don't discount them. And what I think will fix this problem, and it's a little longer term, but I hope that churches start hiring pastors more so on character than just on their charisma or their strengths or their leadership value, right? Yep. Which is unfortunate, especially with bigger churches. The bigger the church, the more important it is to hire him based on his leadership ability. Yep. And then, you might not get a certain individual with character, right? Yeah. So I hope that churches start to make that shift and change. And then also not only in the hiring process, but in the accountability process, building in accountability to the pastors and leaders, so that this stuff doesn't happen with no checks and balances, right? Yeah. But then I want to speak to the fact that, and this is a conversation that I had this week with a certain individual, who's telling me that they don't see Christians living Christian lifestyles. And I was like, that makes me sad, because I don't think that's true. Right. Like, I know a lot of pastors.
We talked about that last week too.
Yeah. And I think there's way more pastors that are of godly character and are not belittling or bullying their congregants or their people in their churches, right? Yeah. This isn't, a problem, I think, en masse, but it is a problem. So I'm not discounting again. Now I'm speaking kind of away from the question. Yeah. If this questioner has been hurt, please find a way to get healing and hold those people accountable. That I want to happen. But I'm just saying, overall, I hope the message that's out there, in our world, in our, culture and all the rest, is not that all churches are horrible. No. Because I don't think they are, right? I think there's lots of pastors that are doing this. Okay. And I hope even for, if someone, again, good intentions, if you've signed up to be a pastor, hopefully, if you have some character flaws, which we all do, when people point them out to you,
which ones?
Hopefully the pastors that are in your churches, if you're at a different church or even in this church, have the integrity and the desire to work on those character flaws, right? Like, I hope that's happening. So I just wanted to say that.
I do see some of the shifts that's coming in and are taking place already and have taken place. As you say, like hiring a leader over their whatever credentials, however you want to see it. I see one of the ways that this is being removed is taking the power out of like an individual's hands and more communal leading. That's happening more and more. So it is less one person's power. And so it's decentralizing that in some ways in a really healthy manner.
Totally.
When it's not built up around the one dynamic person. that's helpful. But yes, I echo everything you're saying, Blake.
Yeah, because Kyle, you and I have even had that conversation. You give anybody absolute authority, it's going to be tough, right? So, yeah.
Before we end, I'll make mention, I should have thought of this early for the intro to our episode. Next week, we're going to be doing a re-release. We'll record an intro for that because next week I'm also gone.
That's true.
So you'll be alone. Not that you don't have a lot of wisdom, Blake, but I don't think the dynamic of our podcast works with just one.
One monologue.
So I'm not sure I believe Doug's back for the week after that. So it might just be 1 week that we're off. So we'll do a re-release episode next week. And so no fresh one then, but we'll see as we're back to it from there. So summer is just different as different vacation schedules line up over one another. So we'll be missing next week. So thanks for tuning in. Keep sending in your questions.
Yes.
But we won't be here next week.
All right. Well, have a great week, guys. As we said, visit invertedorthodoxy.com. That's where you can send in your questions and catch up on all our latest episodes on YouTube. We release them every Wednesday, and find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Till next time, keep exploring your faith and send in your questions. See you guys.
See ya.